Seen a lot of information about weapon transfers from various NATO countries, plus the Swedes and the Finns, to the Ukrainians. Nothing's new there. But what was new was the scale and the technological level. Now, of course, in the case of the United States, this is taking the form of more advanced types of artillery, but it really runs the gamut, and it really is different based on which country you're talking about. So, for example, Slovakia has apparently given their entire air force to the Ukrainians, and they're relying upon their NATO allies in order to patrol their own skies to keep their own defense agreements. Now, this is kind of a defense kickline that we have seen in NATO a couple of times before. Whenever there's a significant change in the geopolitical environment, like there is now, or say when the Cold War ended, weapons move around. So the last time this happened at scale, it was 1992 to 2000. The Soviet system had collapsed. The new European countries were negotiating to accede to NATO, but there was still a lot going on. We saw the Germans and the French and the Italians go through a degree of disarmament because the Cold War was over, and they had treaty limits for how much weapons they could have. So they had to get under that level now that the war was over. They transferred a lot of those weapons to Turkey, which was well under its threshold. So we had some minor upgrading in Western Europe, and then this hand-me-down process going to Turkey, and the alliance got stronger as a result. We're seeing some version of that now with Ukraine. So in the case of the Slovak example, they've transferred their entire air force over. They're buying American and German-made aircraft to replace that. So they're going to get an upgrade, and the older stuff goes on to Ukraine. Some version of this is happening with anti-aircraft radar and with javelins, and with tanks and with artillery. Everyone in the West is moving their older stuff east and then buying new stuff for what they anticipate will be a prolonged period of hostility. Everyone wins, of course, except for the Russians, who have the ammo like thrown into the teeth of their war machine. But the best part of all of this, of course, is that for the Ukrainians, these are weapon systems they already know how to use. This is exactly the same stuff that they had. See, when the Soviet system collapsed, all the Soviet military stuff was everywhere. And in the case of the Central Europeans, and to a lesser degree the Ukrainians, they didn't have the money to upgrade to what are now NATO standards. So NATO changed their standards. And they said that as long as you do some security upgrades so things can't be hacked, and to make it so Russian intelligence won't have a kind of a purchase, will allow you to keep your gear until your economy expands to the point that you can do an overhaul. Well, that overhaul is now happening, and the old stuff is being put to use.
Now, the Ukrainians are definitely punching above their weight. They have only lost about 160 tanks compared to Russia's 660. So, from a video game point of view, that's spectacular. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the story, because the Ukrainians have a limited supply here. If you include all 300 odd tank systems that have been brought in from Central European countries in NATO who want to help the Ukrainians only have about 2,300 tanks. But the Russians have 13,000. I mean, the balance of forces here is not even close. There's some legitimate questions to be asked about how usable those Russian tanks are, because 10,000 of them are in storage. But the fact remains that for the Ukrainians, this is an all-in effort. Their entire male population has been mobilized. Weapons are coming in from the West. Everything they had in a stockpile is going. The Russians are not putting their weight into this yet. And when and if that changes, we're in a very different conflict situation. Now, in order to help the Ukrainians with their numerical inferiority, the United States is providing a number of weapon systems to the Ukrainians. We've talked about the howitzers before, but today I want to talk about two of the systems that have allowed the Ukrainians to take out so many Russian weapon systems. First, we have the javelins. Now, javelins are something that the Ukrainians absolutely love. They're man-portable. They take out any sort of armored vehicle, tanks included. And the issue is that we have already given the Ukrainians 1/4 of our total stockpile. And Lockheed, who is the manufacturer of the Javelin, estimates that at current rates of production, just replacing that stockpile would take 2 years. So in order to keep up with the pace that the Ukrainians are using these weapons, we're talking about needing to build out our manufacturing for the Javelin supply line by at least a factor of 15. That is unlikely, and we haven't started on that yet because that would require congressional approval. The second system that has proven very popular is the Stinger, first popularized by Rambo III and, of course, the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. Well, we've already given the Ukrainians 1/3 of our total stockpile of Stingers, and even worse than the Javelins, Raytheon, the manufacturer, hasn't received a government order for the Stinger in over a decade. In fact, most of the components that go into the Stinger aren't even manufactured anymore. So if we want to keep up with this weapon system, we're talking about having to build out multiple supply lines from scratch in order to incorporate more advanced semiconductors into the systems that are used. That's not going to happen in less than a year. Now, there's two problems here. The first, of course, is for the war as it's being carried out right now, where over the midterm, the Russians are going to experience a greater and greater force advantage. Over the longer term, the Ukraine war is exactly the type of conflict that I predicted in a lot of my work, specifically in The Absent Superpower, where the United States plays favorites in wars and provides equipment and intelligence, but doesn't really get involved itself. Well, if you're backing the weaker power, man-portable weapons like the Javelin and the Stinger are absolutely essential. And at the rate we're going through our stockpile, we're going to run dry this calendar year. So if we do want to use tools like that in order to mess around in other people's wars, in order to tilt them to our favor without actually putting boots on the ground, we need a significant build out as soon as possible. Now, in the short term, this calendar year, the Ukrainians are probably going to cease getting this sort of support from the United States in about 5 or 6 months, because that's when the cupboard will literally be dry. At that point, the balance of force in the war changes drastically. So we really have until next winter to come up with a backup plan, or by then, something's got to give. Ukraine, Russia, supplies, the nature of the war, we'll see. But this phase that we're in, where there's incremental gains going one way or the other day on day, this is not sustainable without a robust weapons transfer system to Ukraine, and that is now unlimited time.
So every country in the world that has imported a lot of Russian equipment to round out their forces or to mainline their forces, they're now having second and third and fourth and fifth thoughts about whether or not this is something they want to do at all. In particular, we should be watching the Indians, because India is the only country that has actually provided the seed and development capital that's necessary to develop some of the more advanced weapon systems, whether it's jets or helicopters or cruise missiles, and they're in the process of backing away from almost all of it. And that is their number one, the Russians' number one market right there. About the only thing about this weapon sales from Iran to Russia that I see that I'm a little bit concerned about is that ground connection thing. Now, Iranians have to basically have line of sight, so there has to be a ground station that can communicate with the drone. In the United States, we use satellites. The Iranians don't have a satellite, but the Russians do. So the Iranians here are probably going to get a lot of great technical data on what it means when you can integrate one of their hardware systems with someone else's communications network. And down the road, that is likely to provide a bit of a boost to the Iranian weapons industry. That's not a problem for today. That's a problem for later. But if you're going to worry about some aspect of that, that's probably what you'd be concerned about.